Welcome to the Health Design Leadership Podcast with author, speaker, and leadership coach Carol Phillips. We're here to help you sharpen your leadership skills and discover the best ways to build great teams. So sit back and enjoy this episode of the Health Design Leadership Podcast with your host, Coach Carol.
Hello, leaders. I'm Carol Phillips. Thank you so much for joining us. We have an amazing guest with us today, and one of the most important leadership qualities we will be discussing is engagement. How engaged are you with all of your team members? How do you engage with others in general? Are you comfortable starting important conversations with others? Would people describe you as a person who strikes a great balance between continuously learning from others while also openly sharing what you've learned along the way? Great leaders know how to keep taking the pulse of what is going on around them while also sharing their knowledge and constructive opinions and ideas to keep everyone moving in a positive direction. Our incredible guest today is John Clayton, who spent 27 years as a reporter and columnist with the New Hampshire Union Leader. John's In the City column was a fixture on the front page of the Union Leader for more than 20 years and won numerous awards, including Best Local Column from the New England Associated Press News Executives and Best Local Author from the readers of New Hampshire Magazine. He's the author of 7 books about Manchester and New Hampshire, including You Know You're in New Hampshire When and Remembering Manchester. John received an Emmy Award for his work with New Hampshire Public Television, where he was the longtime host of New Hampshire Crossroads and was honored by the New Hampshire Humanities Council as one of the state's 40 over 40 cultural icons. Most recently, he was executive director of the Manchester Historic Association. On a personal note, I'm proud to call John a good friend. He's a tireless advocate for our great community and helps to keep the history of Manchester and New Hampshire alive and forefront in people's minds. As we enjoy our conversation with John today, I encourage you to find 1 or 2 new leadership skills you can use to help your team thrive, beginning today. Take some of the great advice from John's experiences and put it into action with the people you lead. Now, let's chat with John Clayton. John, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you again, Carol.
Thank you so much for spending time with us today. John, I like to lovingly refer to you as a walking encyclopedia of the history of Manchester. My parents and grandparents grew up in Manchester, and some of them worked in our wonderful mill yard businesses. I'd like to start off by asking you to share with our listeners your journey to becoming a much beloved Manchester historian and leader.
Happy to do so, Carol, and I hope there are members of your audience who actually know what an encyclopedia is today. Things have changed so much. Well, I'm a Manchester native, grew up on the west side of the city, and am a proud graduate of Manchester Public Schools. I would never have achieved anything that I've done in my career were it not for the incredible teachers I had as a kid. A few days ago, we celebrated National Teachers Day, and I wanted to recognize and honor them here today. So after graduating from Manchester High School West, I knew from early on I wanted to be a journalist. Writing was, other than football, writing was my only skill. So I attended Northeastern University, which was wonderful because it's a 5-year program with semesters spent working in the field. So I actually worked at the Quincy Patriot Ledger, the Derry News, and the Lowell Sun while I was still in college. So when I graduated, I had a lot of experience in the field, and that made it easier to get a job. Ultimately, I wound up at the New Hampshire Union Leader, where I spent 27 years as a reporter and columnist, largely writing about Manchester. And my curiosity about my hometown was really fulfilled in that role. And the simple accumulation of knowledge over time was such that when I left the paper, the Manchester Historic Association called and said, "Would you like to be our executive director?" And I said, "I know nothing about museums." And they said, "You know everything about Manchester. We'll take care of the rest." And so that's where I spent the balance of my career at the MHA. And I got to work in the mill yard every day, just like my mom and dad and just like my grandparents, except I didn't have to wear workers' outfits. I wore dress shirts and shoes, as you know.
It's an amazing place, isn't it?
It is, and it still resonates. The Millyard's future is as bright as its past because the city just received a $25 million build grant that's going to revolutionize transportation around the Millyard. There will be a southern egress from South Commercial Street with a flyover that will go right onto South Elm Street and just open the Millyard up for new development. And a lot of old timers look at me and say, well, why are you endorsing that kind of a thing? And I tell them the Millyard's a living, breathing thing. You can't enclose it in amber and expect it to continue to thrive. So I'm very much a progressive in that way, as I want to see all these new developments in the Millyard make it the vital place it was more than a century ago.
That's terrific. I have several clients in the Millyard buildings, and they are just phenomenal. I'm so happy they were renovated and that they, like you're saying, they are a living, breathing thing and part of our community, which is just amazing.
There was a great piece written by a New York Times columnist named Ada Louise Huxtable back in the mid-1960s when urban renewal was threatening the very existence of the Millyard. There were folks here in town who still had bad memories of Amoscape going out of business and people losing their jobs. And Ada Louise Huxtable wrote this great piece about how important the Millyard was to the city. She praised the uniformity of design and despised the fact that a wrecking ball was coming here to destroy elements of the Industrial Revolution here in the city. And, you know, as a kid, I was probably a junior in high school. My grandmother brought me a copy of the New York Times with that essay. And I will confess, you know, I didn't read the New York Times when I was a junior in high school. I don't think anybody in Manchester did, but it was that piece that really struck a chord with me and sparked my interest in the history of this place that my 4 generations of my family have called home.
Wow, that's amazing. Little did she know at the time, right, when she was sharing that with you.
My grandmother knew. She said, "This, you should read this," and I did, and it took heart.
And then you took off from there. That's amazing. John, I had the privilege of spending a year getting to know you better when we both participated in the Greater Manchester Chamber's Leadership Greater Manchester program, Go Class of 2017, which is an amazing program. And I'll quote this from their website. Quote, Leadership Greater Manchester is a program designed to recognize and nurture existing leadership talents from diverse sectors of the community, end quote. John, please talk to us about your experience in the program and how it benefited your leadership skills.
Well, I had 2 experiences, to be precise. When the program was first begun, the first year, members of the chamber approached me and asked me if I'd be willing to be a part of what was really an experimental program. And I was very excited about it, and I said yes. And they said, well, you know, your bosses have to sign off on it. So I went to Joe McQuaid at the Union Leader and said, they've asked me to participate in this program. I'd like very much to do so. And he said, I don't think so. We're not going to pick 10 days to not work. And so I informed the organizers that I was not going to be able to take part unless I quit my job. And they understood. And lo and behold, 30 years later, I was approached by people at the chamber. I was running the Historic Association. And they said, would you like to take part? I was 63 at the time. And I looked at him and laughed and said, so at 63, you think I might be a leader one day? So we all had a good laugh. And they very graciously explained to me that my participation wasn't so much about what I might learn. It's about what I would bring to the other members of the class who might be new to Manchester. And as a lifelong educator, that struck a chord with me as well. And it made me realize that maybe I could bring things to the class that others might not have experienced. So as you probably recall, every time we did one of our day trips, History Day, Government Day, Transportation Day, we're driving through the airport and our tour guide knew nothing about the history of the airport. So at your urging and urging of the class members, I grabbed the microphone and started telling them how Alan Shepard, the first man in space, was learned to fly at Manchester Airport. And I like to think those little nuggets may have brought some illumination or context to the class. But
yes,
don't misunderstand me. I benefited mightily from the other members of the class. Police Chief Nick Willard, Mike DeSell, who was the Dean of UNH Manchester. We had an amazing group. and it was a privilege to be a part of it.
Yes, we absolutely did. And we did. We had our own built-in tour guide with John Clayton. It was that was a huge benefit. And it's true. Isn't it funny? Maybe it was meant to be that you did it 30 years later because we're all learning from each other all the time.
Absolutely. And one of my great joys is that the tight-knit bond that we forged with our class of 40. Over the years, I've come to learn that other classes, friends of mine who went through it, don't have that bond. They've all gone their separate ways. And I think it's a tribute to us and to the validity of the program that we have remained such a tight-knit group, and we get together often.
Yes.
There was often alcohol involved, but we still get together.
Oh, absolutely. And the way I describe it to people is the first day we met in person at that first meeting, it was like we were all long lost cousins who couldn't wait to see each other again.
It was amazing. And I recall, looking forward anxiously to whatever the next day was going to be, and what are we going to do after the class is over, and how can we use what we learned in those 10 sessions to help make Manchester a better community. Run for office, get involved, volunteer for nonprofits. And I think I was not the only one who understood that. I think all 30 or 40 of us recognize that. And when I look around, there's proof of involvement at so many levels thanks to that program.
Yes, it is an amazing, amazing program. I loved every single minute of it, and I was just honored to be part of that. John, a related topic is community engagement. I love the idea of collaboration over competition, and I believe there are so many benefits of all members of the community, whether it's business leaders, team members, schools, colleges, nonprofits, etc., finding ways to work together and help each other. Please share with our listeners what community engagement means to you and how they can use these practices to help them become better leaders.
Certainly. There was a brief span of 7 years between the Union Leader and the Historic Association, where I worked for the New Hampshire Hospital Association. I was the vice president for communications for all 26 hospitals in the state of New Hampshire. And among the many things I learned is that healthcare is really complicated. But what I took away that was most important to me was what they referred to as cooperation. They were all in the same basic field, and they were competing for patients and methods of care. But there was also the spirit of cooperation in which they supported one another. And the Hospital Association was the unit that brought them all together. And it was just a wonderful way for the smaller community hospitals and the larger acute care hospitals to come to recognize the different needs they had and also the different benefits they provided to the communities in their own way. So, that's kind of been my theory throughout my whole life is, we're better together. And that experience with the Hospital Association really demonstrated that as well as anything else in my professional career.
That's terrific. Yes, we are better all together than just being focused on being competitors.
Mm-hmm. And it manifests itself in a lot of different ways, some professional, some personal. I'm a sucker for volunteerism. I always say yes when I'm asked to MC an event or to be a keynote speaker, because I hope my message is positive and that people enjoy and are entertained at the same time. But very slyly, I'm educating them at the same time about why Manchester is such a special place.
Yeah, I think you succeed there in having a wonderful balance between educating people and keeping everybody positive and excited about the community. In a 2018 interview you did with New Hampshire Business Review as executive director of the Manchester Historic Association, you were asked the following question. For business people who want to invest and succeed in this city, is a knowledge of its history important? And your answer was, I believe it is. I believe that spirit still burns in the mill yard, the legacy of hard work. You need to understand that legacy. And if that spirit still burns here, we at the Manchester Historic Association are keepers of the flame. Can you tell us why it's important for business leaders to know their organization's history and how they can use it to be the keepers of the flame to help their team members feel more invested?
You have to give me a second while I admire the poetry of my words. Uh, it is incredibly important. Dean Kamen, who is, a giant here in the mill yard, has been a friend of mine for over 30 years. And when he first bought this first building here in Manchester, a dilapidated mill building for $100,000, and then invested $1 million in the building, he knew that he was making Manchester something it had been 100 years earlier, but with a vision to the future. And Dean's vision is incredible. He called me a couple of years ago and asked me if I would give him a tour of the Mill Yard Museum. And he said, I know the history of the Mill Yard, but I want to have it presented to me with fresh eyes. And so I did that. And afterward, he said, the reason I wanted to go through this is because I see a way in which Manchester, which was the most important manufacturing city in the world in the 1800s, can become the most important industrial home for the manufacture of human organs. And Dean is not a funny guy. He says funny things, but I looked at him like he was pulling my leg. And he said, John, the only difference between science and science fiction is time. And now is the time for Manchester to embrace this future. So again, when people ask me, a devout historian, why I am willing to accept some of these more progressive plans, it's because of that vision again, that Manchester, it's what we can be. What we were is a done, but what we can be is an open book. As excited as I get about the history of the city, no one's more excited about the future of the city than I am. And we need to engage these leaders and make them understand that they are now a part of a legacy that still burns, as I said so eloquently in that newspaper article.
Actually, I love that. I thought that was just terrific because it really does convey the importance, because sometimes people just don't know the history. And when they learn the history, it helps them to feel more passionate and purposeful in their work.
And connected.
Right.
When my office in the mill yard looked right out over the Wambeck Mill, where my grandparents and parents worked. And so when you have that tangible legacy right in front of you, how can you not let it affect the way you look forward as well as the way you look backward?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Almost every time I'm in one of the buildings, I'm thinking about my grandparents who were literally there working years ago. And it's fascinating. John, you've donated countless hours as a community volunteer over the years. Please share with us some of your experiences and how business leaders can use active volunteerism to improve their leadership skills.
I would say the most important one, or the one that resonates most with people from Manchester, is the fact that my grandfather was raised in what we know today as the Webster House. When my great-grandparents came here in 1883, my great-grandfather died shortly thereafter. So my great-grandmother was left with my grandfather, 5 years old at the time. And because things were different then, there was no dole, there was no welfare program. My great-grandmother had to continue working. So my grandfather was one of the first 23 residents of the Webster House when it opened as the Manchester Children's Home. And over time, my father was always good about sharing his family history. And that was a big part of it. The fact that my grandfather was raised at the Webster House. So as my professional career went on, people asked me to write about events. The Webster House is having its 125th anniversary. Would you be the master of ceremonies? And most people at the time didn't know about my family's history with that nonprofit organization. So because I'm always looking for column material, I wrote a column on the Monday. The event was on Tuesday. I wrote a column on the Monday and made it known that my ties to the Webster House went far beyond just altruistic means. It's everything my family has been able to achieve. And that includes my 5 siblings and me, my daughter and my 2 grandchildren, is attributable in part to what the Webster House provided to this community. So when they asked me to serve on the board, how do you say no to something that is tied to your family's legacy? So I served 5 years as chairman of the board of the Webster House. And about 2 months ago, I was very honored to be the guest of honor at their 140th anniversary gathering. So to me, that's an example of how you can find a niche in which you can become engaged and, in my case, run with it.
That is amazing. And Right. How can that not be such a huge connection? And to educate the young people on the importance of places like the Webster House.
Mhm. And I'm not a political person. I certainly have my opinions, but I'm not a political animal. Yet when people approach me to serve on the Manchester Charter Commission, it was an elected position, nine members. I reluctantly agreed to sign up. I'm not a here we are talking about engagement. I'm not a great collaborator. As a journalist, I was a really a lone wolf. I would take my own pictures and find my own stuff and work alone. But the collaborative nature of something like being elected to the City Charter Commission is something that I accepted as my community's calling on me. And subsequently, I served on the school charter commission as well. So those are the two elected positions I've held in my career: collaborative, community focused. It will never happen again.
And the more we learn, isn't it amazing? In such a small world.
Oh, it is. And again, being natives, we know people instinctively. And when I was asked to take on a development role at the Milliard Museum, I reluctantly said, all right, but I was wary about it. And they said, it's not what you know in this case, it's who you know. You know everybody. And that can only help open doors because of my individual connections to so many people in the community. It's one of the great things about living here.
What a benefit. What a great benefit.
Mm.
John, can you share with us one of your favorite memories of being the executive director of the Manchester Historic Association, in particular, as it relates to your role as a leader?
Well, this is going to sound contradictory, but one of my great victories was when I convinced the board of directors at the museum to have a first beer tasting. Now, that may sound really superfluous and superficial, but I tried to explain to them that engaging the community means engaging everyone. Now, there's a natural tendency to assume that if you're involved in a historic association, you would tend to be older and less, actively involved. And that may be the case. But I'm looking for the audience that we weren't reaching, which is younger people who might be new to the community, who would prefer a beer tasting to a lecture on the history of General John Stark. And pardon my saying so, I was right. It worked. We had so many people come to the museum who had never been there before. It's a way to develop new memberships and get people engaged with our mission. And when they leave that event, they're not just buzzed, they're buzzing about what's going on in Manchester. And I that sounds silly, but I just thought that was a breakthrough moment for the association to realize that we can't be a stuck in the mud, backward looking organization. We have to look forward. And the forward looking part is engaging these young people who now call Manchester home.
Yes. And they're the future older leaders someday. And I love that play on words, by the way.
Thank you. Get paid for that kind of stuff.
All right, John, are you ready for Coach Carroll's quick quiz?
They told me to be no math. That's all I'm going to say.
There's no math. I'm going to throw some questions out at you just for fun, and so our listeners can learn more about you. There's 5 questions. Just give me the first thing that comes to mind. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
You're ready? Okay, number 1. If you could have dinner with any historical figure, who would it be and why?
I've been asked the question before, and my answer was Winston Churchill. And people say, why? And I said, if not for him, we might be conducting this interview in German. He was everything. He was a journalist. He was a politician. He was a soldier. I like the journalist part most, but I just think he would be a fascinating individual. Closer to home, it would be Dean Kamen because of his appreciation for Manchester's history and his vision for the city's future.
Yes. Oh, connecting the past with the present. I like that, John.
Mm-hmm.
All right, number 2. What is your superpower?
Wow. I'm glad my wife's not here. She might have answered that before I could. I think it's in the engagement, the ability to speak to people, find common ground, which is not a political thing, by the way. I think you know that. And just being open to new ideas and new people.
I totally agree with that. That is definitely you to a T. All right, number 3. If you could travel back in time and visit the mill yard, what year would you choose and what would you want to witness in real time?
I would choose 1810, which is obviously a very specific date, because that is the year in which the first canal in the mill yard was built. A gentleman named Samuel Blodgett, not unlike Dean Kamen, had this audacious vision to create a canal that would allow goods to move up and down the Merrimack River, all the way to Concord and beyond. So if you were growing corn in Concord, you could use this canal to come down to Manchester and sell your crops. He was a visionary, and that simple vision came to fruition in 1810. He died in 1807, but in 1810, when the canal was opened, the city fathers of Manchester, of what was then known as Derryfield, decided that in honor of his vision, I see this city on the banks of this river that shall one day rival Manchester and England as an industrial power. The city fathers voted to change the name of this community to Manchester in honor of Samuel Blodgett's vision.
Wow.
For which I'm glad, because I would not want to tell people I lived in Blodgettville, New Hampshire.
The history of Manchester is really, really fascinating. And there's times when I think about how I would love to be a fly on the wall when they were building those buildings, and also when my grandmother worked there. You know, what did a day in their lives look like? So different than ours today. Number 4, what would your dream vacation look like?
Well, I've traveled everywhere in Europe, but I'm a homeboy. There's no denying it. And as a kid, the biggest treat of all was my parents would rent a cottage in Hampton Beach for 1 week every summer. And then as we got older, it was 2 weeks. And then as we grew older and were able to buy a place for my parents for the summer, it came to a month. And I tell people, it's like, holy cow, alert the Rockefellers. The Claytons are in the Hamptons. Not the same Hamptons, but so now my daughter grew up with that same love for the seacoast that I have. And so as simple as it seems, as close to home as it seems, Colleen and I are going to be spending a lot of time at North Beach in Hampton this summer. And that's my dream.
That's terrific. And, you know, my parents did the same thing. They rented a cottage at Hampton Beach each summer. And I have so many amazing memories of just spending time there with my family, my siblings. And I remember they actually it was a produce truck as opposed to the ice cream truck, a produce truck that used to drive around, and they'd stop and we could pick apples and plums. And it was just part of the day there. It's a wonderful place. So thank you so much for sharing that. Okay, number 5. What is your favorite piece of advice to give new business leaders?
Be flexible. Understand that everything is not going to be under your control, and you have to be adaptable. One of the great elements in the history of Manchester is the way in which the city was able to adapt to challenging circumstances. You know, when Amoskeag Manufacturing went bankrupt in 1936, it was the city fathers who improvised on the spot, came together, created an entity called Amoskeag Industries. They went to the bankruptcy court and raised $5 million in less than a month to buy up all the assets of the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company, which preserved those elements of the city, the history of the city that we love. And it was due to their adaptability and flexibility. And be nimble, be able to turn on a dime, and your business will be better off for that agility.
Yes, that's great advice. And I think sometimes leaders hesitate being flexible and adaptable because they may fear appearing as not being all-knowing and prepared and ready to make quick decisions that aren't their own. But in reality, the more flexible and adaptable we are, the better we're going to work with other people and reach out for things that, like you were just saying, most people might not think would be attainable.
Here I am contradicting myself again as an historian, but the phrase I hate more than any other is because we've always done it that way. Now, again, you would think that's counter to my nature, but it's true, because we've always done it that way. That's the stuck in the mud thing. We never would have had a beer tasting at the Milliard Museum because we'd never had one before. And, it became a simple breakthrough moment. And that's part of the adaptability and ready to change.
Absolutely. Absolutely. John, thank you so much for being such a good sport with our Coach Carol's quick quiz. Before we wrap up today, is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners?
No, I love the technology that allows for us to engage in this kind of a dialogue. 25 years ago, we'd have to be sitting in the same coffee shop to be doing this. And now we can do it remotely. And I like spending time with people, but sometimes this is a more effective means of communication because we're not reaching just one person, we're reaching thousands.
Yes, for sure. John, what's the best way for listeners to learn more about you, reach you, and purchase your great books?
I am very prolific on Facebook, so you can find me there. In our recent journey downtown, I post every day and tag all the various restaurants we visit, and the restaurateurs love that because it's, whoa, John Clayton goes there? Maybe we should go there. My books were published under my own company called In the City Publishing. They are available on Amazon. My two latest books are You Know You're in New Hampshire When, ... and Remembering Manchester, Towering Titans and Unsung Heroes. And just do John Clayton on Amazon. And there are several John Claytons posing under my name, legitimate authors, but they don't write about Manchester.
Yes, and if people Google John Clayton, Manchester, New Hampshire, you will find a wealth of information.
An embarrassing wealth of information.
No, it is absolutely terrific. And I invite our listeners to go check out all the great information and videos on John Clayton. John, thank you so much for being with us today and for being such a wonderful leader and historian who helps to keep the history of our community alive and well.
You're the best, Carol. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Listeners, you can reach out to John via his email at ulcolumnist@yahoo.com and check out all his great books on Amazon. Thank you to all the business leaders listening today who are making their companies the best places to work. Be on the lookout for our next podcast and make today a great day.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Health Design Leadership Podcast with Carol Phillips. Be sure to click on the subscribe button so you won't miss any new episodes. Join our online leadership dream team at askcoachcarol.com. If you're looking for an engaging speaker for your next event or an effective trainer to strengthen your leadership team, contact Coach Carol today. Thanks again for listening and make it a great day.